right, good afternoon, everyone. That's bad. We're going to have to up this a little bit. Good afternoon, everyone. See, there we go. Just to introduce myself, my name is Dr. Veldsman, as mentioned, and it's really fantastic to have this opportunity to be here with you today. And I think to share a couple of thoughts that we've observed, and we have the privilege to work with HR professionals in more than 140 countries around how they are adopting AI. We've listened a lot today about what the opportunity in the future looks like, and I'd like to reflect a little bit, we just wait for the presentation to pop up, on what is currently happening, where are the struggles currently, and what should we be thinking about as we start progressing into the future. Now, a couple of things. We need to contract two things before we start if we're going to get through this next 25 minutes together. First one, I speak very quickly, and I have a very, very heavy accent. So at any point in time, if I speed up, if anybody in the crowd gives me two arms up, I know I need to slow down. I take zero offense to that, so please hold me accountable with regards to that. The second thing, I'm going to kind of run through a couple of our studies. I'll show you a couple of graphs there as well. I am going to also share the presentation with anybody that is interested. It's more important that for the next 25 minutes, we agree on the main conversation in terms of what it's going to do for us in AI in the future. So 3 thoughts I want to share. I'm going to start with the 4 forces that's shaping the future of work. And it's important because AI is happening in a context. It's not happening isolated, and we need to take awareness of that. The second one, I want to talk about the impact that AI is going to have on the future of HR. I'm a very, very passionate HR professional. We've heard a lot of great narratives already today. What does that mean? And I want to highlight 3 things that we're already starting to see shift in terms of how HR teams and organizations are starting to think about the future. And then lastly, I want to challenge you around where to from here. It's fantastic that we have these conferences and these conversations, but what do we do afterwards? And what's that conversation going to look like? So very briefly, the 4 forces that's really shaping the context within which AI is taking place. The first one we've heard a lot about. The composition of the labor market is changing. Globally, there's a paradox. In some areas, we have an aging population. In other sides, such as in India, we have a rising youth population. The point I want to make, the question we need to ask as HR professionals is really around the fact that how is AI going to influence what work looks like? And one of the biggest opportunities is for us to rethink work design and how and where work takes place. The second one is around resource scarcity. We heard a lot about skills mismatches. We heard a lot about upskilling. How are we going to bridge the gap in order to make sure that AI brings us together and does not further divide us in terms of access to AI opportunities in future? Advances in technology, I'm going to double click on that in terms of the impact specifically on AI, but we all know that that's not the only thing that's happening. There's also other technologies that's starting to shift and change the way that we live our lives and the way that we think about work. And then lastly, there's a new relationship with work and employment. Today, talent wants something different. And all of us sitting around the table as HR professionals, we have to think innovatively about our employee value propositions and our talent strategies that's going to dictate the future. But for today, let's double down on what is AI going to do in HR and what does that mean for us in the workplace and beyond. We know that there's a significant promise pertaining to productivity, and that's why we've all been interested as organizations to say, how can we start leveraging and utilizing generative AI to unlock productivity? Now, we believe as human beings that we've gotten faster, we believe we've gotten smarter, but globally, if you look at productivity since the 1990s, we haven't necessarily become more productive. So we're asking this question around, can AI help us to unlock productivity within the workplace and within the workforce? And we're already starting to see some of this evidence in place. Secondly, we want to go beyond that and really ask the question around, it's not just about being productive, but will AI allow us to do things that we've never been able to do before? Will it unlock certain capabilities? And to put it in blunt terms, is it going to give us access to skills and knowledge for us as human beings to be able to augment what we do currently? And there's already a couple of studies out there that's starting to show some significant promise here in terms of what knowledge workers can do when they augment, and I'm going to use that word a lot, and you've already heard it quite a few times, when they augment their skills and their work with AI. Now, for me personally, as an HR professional, there's a bigger question. Is AI not the key to unlocking purposeful, meaningful work in the future? If we think about that, employee engagement globally has been trending downwards. There's a lot of uncertainty within the workplace and in the work environment. And can we not utilize AI instead of driving the fear narrative, but it will be to be a narrative around what the future of work and work design is going to look like? Because AI will become a core part of your workforce. Now, we've seen the market also explode in terms of investment, in terms of AI, from new vendors coming into the market, as well as on the other side, also significant investments made by organizations in things like upskilling, new tools, etc. The question we need to ask there is it actually starting to bear fruit or not? This is a study that we did last year around how AI is being applied in HR. And what was really interesting to see is that there's certain areas that keeps on adopting and moving forward. And you can kind of see there, recruitment, selection, talent acquisition. We've seen a lot about that. Predominantly vendor-driven, though, at the moment, and not necessarily initiated by the organization. But we are still in the early days in most of the HR practices and what that's going to look like. Some fantastic new opportunities in things like L&D, performance, coaching, etc. But we still have a really long way to go before that becomes the norm and the way of work. We also then have to acknowledge around the fact that for more than 60% of HR professionals, they say, we know we utilize some of these tool sets. I do it to write my emails, to consolidate all my data, my information. But you know what? AI hasn't necessarily yet been integrated into how I work with others or into the practices and processes that we have within the HR team and HR department. And I think that's such an important point because we keep on talking about adoption, but adoption at what particular level? If we really want to showcase value in future, we need to adopt AI not just at the individual level and all of us utilizing things like Copilot and ChatGPT, but actually become a lot more AI-driven in the way that we design what HR does within the organization. When we start thinking about this adoption, though, there is still this idea around, and you can ask the question, but why are people not adopting AI? And we've heard fear, and we've heard a couple of other reasons. But what I think is quite interesting, that for a lot of people, there's uncertainty of the ROI. There's this story around the fact that the dog runs, barks at the bus, it catches the bus, and then it's like, but what on earth do I do with it now? And a lot of people are saying, it's fantastic to use these tools to consolidate my travel itinerary and the recipes I want, but what business value does it actually bring that warrants the amount of investment that we need in future? Other things there also around how are we going to measure success? How are we going to think about privacy and security? And we've heard a lot about new legislation that's already being promulgated and it's coming into play around how we will start utilizing AI. And HR is going to be a part of that. We're also afraid of things like this. Organizations already starting to see the negative effect, the dark side. And I think the speaker this morning phrased it beautifully when he said, our AI models are not yet good enough for everything that we expect it to do. There's still a lot of work we need to do pertaining to things like bias and making sure that we are able to adopt AI responsibly. And this remains a barrier today for a lot of organizations and then HR professionals being hesitant and risk-averse to say, but I'm not going to try that. I first want to see what somebody else does before I actually ingrain it into my work. The last point I want to make here is then the question around, but how do HR professionals learn about AI? Where do we find it? And what was really interesting in this study that we did was around the fact that for most HR professionals, they learn through self-exploration. They learn through being curious by playing with some of these tool sets. But what was quite interesting was the fact that it was in their personal lives and not in a professional environment. Also leading towards the fact that we're starting to find that a lot of organizations are not giving enough room for people to experiment in a safe way when we start thinking about AI in the future. And then really the last point I want to make here is if we are going to leverage the promise of AI and what it offers us as HR professionals, we have to move beyond this level where it's only about individual productivity and AI as a companion that helps me do my work, that takes away some of my tasks, that takes away some of my activities. We have to start thinking about AI as a colleague that you work with that can do things that you can't do, that complements and augments the skill set that you have. And in future, Also really looking at AI as a custodian, something that can drive and run end-to-end decision-making, becoming a core part of the workforce and the way that we think about our operating models. Obviously, always keeping the human in the loop in terms of the important decisions that we need to make. But if we're really going to leverage the opportunity that AI holds, we have to start thinking beyond just putting in your recipes and your travel itinerary into it, and really start designing our HR practices and organizations from an AI-driven perspective. Now, I've given you a lot of context, and I want to share just 3 ideas really around, but what does the impact actually look like for us on the future of HR? Before I do that, everybody still with me? Still making sense? Okay, I have like 5 nods at the back. My goal then is to also have some at least in the corner there at the back before we end. Everybody in the back, you still there? You awake? Oh, that back right area is a problem. Left, doing great. Okay, what's the impact of AI on the future of HR? 3 ideas I want to leave you with. The first one really is around changing skills. And we know that that's been a conversation for a number of years around the changing and emerging skill set of the HR professional. I want to highlight 2 things there just around the fact that we have to really think about what those skill sets are, because skills are a very, very broad term. And the question I want to pose, is it the same skills for absolutely everyone? The next thing I'm going to talk about is changing models of delivery and engagement. We need to acknowledge that a lot of the models and practices that we've had for decades and decades within HR is no longer going to work in future. I'm not saying we need to throw everything out. I am saying we need to adapt a lot of what we do today if we're really going to make sure that we remain relevant. And then lastly, the redefinition of value and impact. I think this question around who do we contribute for and what is that going to look like in the future? So changing skills and capabilities. I've spoken about this really, and if we ask the question, what skill sets do we actually need to be able to incorporate AI successfully into HR? There's a couple of things to remember. And I think the first one is that all of us will require some base skills and AI proficiency. It's like learning a foreign language. You have to have some basic understanding of what the language is, how it works, what sentence construction looks like, if you are going to be successful in accessing these tool sets and leveraging their potential. A lot of people still say, I'm still struggling with how to write a good prompt. That's just part of the growth curve that we do need to go through. So all HR professionals will require some level of proficiency in terms of basic AI. The second one, there will be some that requires technical skills, but that's not for all of us. So the technical skills here is really going to be for people that configure these technologies. Think about people that configure things in centers of excellence, that build a lot of the technologies that we utilize day to day. And then at the last piece there, really, the advanced skills when we start thinking about security, when we start thinking about privacy and how ongoing learning is going to dictate the success of these models in future. What is really interesting to see, and this was a study done by Deloitte, was everybody's talking about the technical skills. But what we're starting to realize more and more and more, it's not the technical skills that's going to get you there. It's the combination of technical skills and behavioral skills, things like critical thinking. And a really interesting study came out 2 weeks ago, and it's still early days for the results, but it said that if we don't guard and teach people critical thinking, that's one of the first things that they will forget how to do in an age of AI in future. But for me, really, the question is a lot more around, are you going to be able to keep on learning? And we've been talking for a number of years about learning organizations, and that's the way that we need to push forward. But really, the question for me is, can you adapt fast enough in order to be able to continue learning as these models evolve? One of the speakers spoke earlier about ChatGPT in 2022. Think about how you think about that technology today versus a mere 26, 27 months ago. It's a whole new vocabulary that we had to learn if we're going to engage with that. So the question is not, can you use AI today? The question is, can you utilize what AI is going to become in the future? And are you going to make sure that your skills keep up to pace? What we found in our research, which I think is quite noteworthy just to mention, is that traditional upskilling and training people and throwing licenses at them, if I may be so blunt for a moment, is not going to help with AI adoption. We find it has to go further than that, really, in terms of 4 E's. The first one, we have to educate people. Yes, cognitively, you need to know what it is, understand what it's about, know what it can do. Secondly, we have to equip people There's so many organizations that give people training, but then from there they've got nowhere to go and apply that training in a safe environment. And then they're saying, but hang on, I've got competence, but I don't have confidence, and I'm not necessarily going to apply it in my job. We need to then also expose people. My stat I showed earlier is that most HR professionals learn through self-exploration, which means I don't sit around the table and say, hey, how are you utilizing AI? I've never actually tried it in that way. AI shaming will become a big thing, where a lot of people just say, oh, I'm supposed to know, but I don't, so I'm just not going to ask. And we're going to lose that people as we start moving forward. And then lastly, then we need to elevate. Then we need to scale it. So start small, pilots, learn from it, and then only from there start implementing at scale within the organizations that we think about. This is really important because what we find with most of our conversations is really this idea when people say, I'm going to upskill my people, is I buy an online course for them and I give them a license to actually start utilizing to summarize their emails. That's not upskilling. That's literally just giving people a tool. It's going to be a lot more about how we build the skill sets that has to sit around the technology in future. My second point then is really around the fact that there will be changing models of delivery and models of engagement. You have to be aware of the fact that AI will not only be in the workforce, it's going to be a core part of the workforce in future. And there's this fantastic question to think about, who's going to manage all the AI agents that keep on running around when we start outsourcing a lot of today's work for them in fact. And there's been a lot of really good developments in this space, but I think as HR professionals, when we start thinking about things like workforce planning, what does that mean in terms of how we're also going to utilize AI to bridge that skills gap that I spoke about right at the beginning of the presentation? We also have to be aware that as AI starts taking more and more decisions within the workplace, who's going to govern that? There's a lot of organizations where AI almost autonomously starts making certain decisions that affects the workforce. Do we have sight of that? Is that transparent? And what are the rules of the game as these things start to shift and change a lot more? What we will see, however, is a much more human-centric, high-touch way of thinking about things like employee experience and the models of HR of the future. Now, I'm not saying, again, throw out your operating model. That's not the point I'm making, but I am saying ask the question around, are you really going to be able, in the age of AI, to start engaging with the workforce in the way that you do today? I think there's a massive opportunity for us in terms of things like employee experience if we start thinking very, very differently about the opportunity that AI brings in terms of the way that we think about employees as a consumer. I often ask my teams and clients we work with this question. I say, if HR was a product, would your employees buy it with their own money? And if they say, why not? If they say no, I say, why not? They say, oh, you know, the systems are old. It's not necessarily designed in a great way. It's difficult to ask people. Then I said, but then you're not set up as an employee-centric HR organization. AI allows us to do that, and I think for the very first time, we can really step into the shoes that we've been promising for the last 25 years when we've been talking about becoming a strategic partner that drives employee experience at all the different levels. But that's going to call for a very, very new type of model in terms of how we think about the future. And then lastly, we're going to have to redefine our value and our impact. There was an interesting question this morning around, but what are some of the metrics that we do need to start looking around? I almost want to say there's a bigger question. What value are we actually going to add as an HR profession? Because it's not about whether we're going to be there or not. The question is a lot more about what does our new contribution look like in this age of AI, where we start augmenting human beings and technology a lot more into the future. We also need to acknowledge that we see a lot more of this. Employee expectations changing, the pace of work increasing, our role not only in adopting AI ourselves, but also, as the previous speaker mentioned, really this idea around guiding the change for the organization and managing the barriers that we see, that we also need to acknowledge that there's a very different type of stakeholder that we are going to have to look after as HR professionals in the future. Yes, it's about employees and how we utilize AI for the employee experience. Yes, it is about leaders and how we support them. Fantastic panel on that earlier today as well. But it is also then about the stakeholders. And can I say at a broader level, society in terms of what AI is going to do to the world of work. And we as HR professionals need to be involved in that conversation. Because if you take out one thing from my talk today, is that AI is not about technology. AI is a lot more about human beings and our interaction with technology and what that's going to look like in the future that we will be able to craft. So what does this mean, and what is the call to action? What are some of the things that we need to consider as we go forward? I firmly believe that we are at the cusp of a crossroad, and we've got three options ahead of us as HR professionals. Future one is really about the fact it's a steady as we go scenario. We keep on doing what we've been doing today. We risk our relevance in the future of work. We risk being left behind. And we hold on to a lot of the perceptions that people still hold about what HR is today, even though all of us in this room know that what we do today is very different than what we did 5 years, 10 years, 15 years ago. So our first option is to do nothing. And I think we've done that in the past with a lot of the newer technologies. And I think it's a missed opportunity if we do not grasp this. The second one is a future transformed, where we say, how can we start utilizing AI to do what we already know is required within the HR domain? How do we start thinking about high-touch personalization in terms of rolling that out and really making sure and making absolutely sure that we leave nobody behind in terms of what the future is going to look like? But what I do want to position is that I firmly believe that there's a third option around the fact that there's so much possibility of things that we do not even know yet is going to be possible. As I said at the beginning, we are at the beginning of the AI race. And it feels like we've been here for an extended period of time because so much has happened over the last 2.5, 3 years that we sometimes forget that this is the starting line, it's not the finish line. And I firmly believe if we can start shifting into that third scenario, a lot more thinking about HR as an organization in its own right, new solutions, really thinking about a broader stakeholder community, and starting to think about our employees almost in a consumer-driven manner to say, can we use AI to make this better, more attractive, more meaningful, more impactful, and more transparent? I really believe then that the future has got so much opportunity for us as HR. I want to end just with this idea to say that there's never ever been a better time to be in HR than right now. The future is scary, but there's so much opportunity on the horizon. But the challenge and the question I want to leave you with is, are you going to be courageous enough to also transform yourself in terms of what is required of our beautiful profession in the future? Thank you very much.
I really loved the presentation.
Thank you.
However, my question comes from a very grassroots level. We at Euphoria Consulting, we design OD interventions for the Indian subcontinent. Most of our clients are Indian organizations in the manufacturing sector as well as fintech. For us, AI currently is definitely a reality, but before that, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So if I were to ask you a question that what are the 3 capabilities that would really make sense in terms of to be able to deliver or help them build those top 3 capabilities even before we reach this level?
Yeah, no, great question. And I think first the acknowledgement is that different places in the world are at different stages, right? I think in terms of the adoption journey, and that's important. 3 things that I think every human being needs, whether you are engaging in AI already or not. First one is curiosity. You have to be curious about what's changing around you because it's going absolutely so fast that you will be left behind if you're not curious. The second one is problem solving. Can you apply really that thinking and that conceptual thinking to start spotting patterns between different things and coming up with, but what do I do here? Because AI, especially at a companion level, is a problem-solving companion. And the third one is critical thinking. What do I do with the outputs? Can I trust it? Does it ring true? What do I actually utilize and how do I use it? So those 3 for me are crucial for us if we are going to be able to survive at all levels. I don't think it's necessarily focused at particular levels, only or certain types of industries.